So it's good to be able to study the Bible together. We're in 2 Corinthians. We're going to study chapter 6 and 7 together today. Actually, we've already studied chapter 7 as a part of the introduction. I think the key to understanding chapter 6 and 7 is found in chapter 6 and verse 1. When we read from Paul, as God's fellow workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. This is part of an extended defense of Paul's ministry. I want to point out that the subject is not apostasy. The subject is not a problem among the Corinthians that they have walked away from faithfulness to God. The subject is the alignment of some at Corinth with the false teachers. So Paul in this section is trying to say something to answer his opponents who were saying that the presence of problems in his life was an evidence against him, that he was not a genuine apostle, that he was not a genuine preacher of God's message. We have a lot of things that we want to try to get to today, so I'm going to pass over some things by way of the introduction a bit quickly, just to summarize where we've been from chapters 1 and 2 and many other biblical texts, especially in 1 Corinthians and the book of Acts. We have tried to understand how very, very much Paul cared for the Corinthian church. From the establishment of that church, which we read about in Acts chapter 18, until the time that we're reading about Paul in Macedonia, writing a letter, getting ready to send it to Corinth by the hand of Titus, whom he has met in Macedonia. We have counted at least 8 to 10 interventions on the part of Paul, letters, visits, sending people, sending his representatives, communication. So Paul had a very caring relationship with the Corinthian church. And we did that study in the introduction. And then we came to understand that Paul begins after the introductory materials of chapter 1, the first 11 verses, in chapter 1, verse 12, and into chapter 2, and into chapter 7, that Paul sets forth a defense or explanation of his ministry. And again, probably anticipating the need to answer his opponents. And we noted previously the construction of the book, trying to make clear the way this book functions. So we looked at the reading in chapter 2 and verses 12 and 13. Now, when I went to Troas to preach the gospel, found the Lord had opened a door. I had no peace of mind. I did not find my brother Titus. I said goodbye and went to Macedonia. Chapter 7, verse 5, when we came to Macedonia. So we can see the continuation of the historical narrative. And we come to understand, beginning in chapter 2:14 through chapter 7, verse 4, I just simply said on the PowerPoint slide, chapters 2 to 7, Paul is explaining his ministry, and our goal is to apply those ministry principles in our own lives. Now, if we were to try to give a quick overview of everything Paul says, beginning in chapter 2, verse 14, through chapter 7, verse 4, I'm somewhat anticipating, but it's a good overview. We might say that Paul has spoken about his ministry as a ministry of knowledge, the aroma of Christ spreading the knowledge of God, spreading the knowledge of the good news. His is a ministry of the new covenant, a servant of the new covenant, chapter 3, a ministry of glory, so that he is, and we also, are transformed from glory to glory. A ministry of the word, that was the focus of chapter 4 in the first part, a ministry of the knowledge of God's glory. A ministry of power, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, to make clear that the power is not ours, but that it is from God. It is a ministry of faith, having the same spirit of faith we speak with confidence and with glory. The abundance of the glory that we anticipate, looking at things that are unseen, not at the things that are seen, so we don't lose heart. Just reviewing briefly, it is a ministry of confidence. In chapter 5 and verse 1, the things that we know. So we have confidence. This world is not the end. We live in a temporary tabernacle, a temporary house, but there is a building of God, not made with hands, that is ours eternal in the heavens. So we walk by faith, not by sight. We have a confidence. Paul's was a ministry of persuasion. Chapter 5, verse 11. Just reviewing here. Since we know what it is to fear the Lord, we try to persuade men. This was the introduction to the ministry of reconciliation. It is a heavenly ministry. That's the way I've chosen to describe it, because we do not look at the things that happen in this world according to worldly standards. We don't judge people according to worldly standards. We don't look at the life of Christ according to worldly standards. Paul says, I used to look at Christ according to the standards of the world, but that was back whenever I was a Jew. But now that I've become a Christian, I no longer see him from a worldly point of view or according to the wisdom of the world. A ministry of reconciliation, that's where we are today. As we pick up in chapter 6 and verse 1, a couple of verses that actually relate to the previous chapter, and Paul speaking about what we do as Christians. Remember that we have tried to look at 2 Corinthians to this point through a variety of English words. Who we are, what we have, what we know, and then how do we behave ourselves, what it is that God is calling us to do, and we might say to be, but how do we live out the ministry of Paul in our own lives, a ministry of reconciliation? What actions should we find in our lives to encourage reconciliation? Paul will say today that his is also a ministry of hardships, and I think a good way to summarize the entirety of this section we're going to examine is that his is a ministry of relationships, that he might encourage faithful relationships. So we come to chapter 6, beginning in verses 1 and 2, to try to understand what's going on. Many translations talk about being God's co-worker. It's very interesting that the original phrase simply says working together. And so whether you say working together with God or working together with other co-laborers in the gospel, or whether you say working together with the Corinthians, all of those things are being inserted into the text by those who translate. Paul simply says we're co-laborers. This is not only our ministry. This is not only our commitment. It is the commitment we share. It is somehow a work that involves others, whether we speak about laboring with God or with other Christians, or Paul with the Corinthians. And probably all of those are true. Maybe the reason for the absence of any other descriptor is that Paul is trying to say this is a very broad ministry that we share. We come to chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. We know these verses very, very well, especially verse 2. In the time of my favor, I have heard you. In the day of salvation, I have helped you. Now is the time of God's favor. Now is the time of salvation. Paul quotes Isaiah 49, verse 8, in the Septuagint, to say that God is always listening. God is always available to help. Now is not the time to shrink back from the shared ministry that the Corinthians were sharing with Paul when Paul had come among them. They began as co-laborers together. They participated in the ministry. They were a part of it. They were involved in it. But it seems that somehow with the coming of these false teachers or false apostles, there's been a shift. The loyalty of at least some of the Corinthians has shifted away from Paul. So I think the way we should understand 6 verse 2 is now is not the time to shrink back from the shared ministry that Paul is describing. Certainly I have no problem making the application as motivation in evangelistic efforts today. All I'm pointing out is that's probably not what Paul was talking about as we read it in the original context. He's speaking rather about the ministry of reconciliation, so that we labor together, and the idea that now is the time of God's favor, now is the day of salvation, is probably more focused on the workers of those who share the gospel than it is for those who are receiving the gospel. That is, let's keep going. Let's keep doing what God has called us to do. Let's keep ministering. Let's keep serving. Let's keep evangelizing, because this is the day of God's favor. This is the day of salvation. That's the context in which we read chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. In chapter 6, verses 3 through 10, returning to the PowerPoint slide, Paul has a ministry that has been characterized by hardships. Paul wants to make certain that his ministry is not a cause of stumbling. He says we put no stumbling block in anyone's path, so our ministry will not be discredited. If anyone's going to stumble, Paul wants them to stumble because of the message of Jesus Christ. There may be people who struggle with the message of Jesus Christ. I'm thinking of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. It may look like foolishness. It may not be consistent with the wisdom of the world. It may look like powerlessness. It may look like weakness. It may not be consistent with how the world defines power, but Paul sought to minister with transparency. So we come to 6:4 through 10, and I'm going to very quickly divide this section without reading it, because you can read it, into 3 parts. First of all, in the first part, Paul lists a number of things that are negatives. He talks about endurance, afflictions, hardships, distress, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleeplessness, and hunger. Beginning in verse 6, in the second part, there's a list of positives. He says that they were laboring with purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, in the Holy Spirit, genuine love, word of truth, power of God, weapons of righteousness that would both attack and defend. That's probably the meaning of to the right and to the left. And then in the third part, verses 8 through 10, Paul gives us a list of contrasts: glory and dishonor, slander and praise, deceivers yet true, unknown yet well known, dying but living, scourged but not dying, sorrowful yet rejoicing, poor but making many rich, having nothing, possessing everything. And so we look at this description of the hardships of Paul's ministry, and we could see 3 different kinds of lists that he mentions in that, which brings us to, or brings us back to, this ministry of relationships. And I want to note with you the connection between chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, and chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. I've set them forth here with an intervening thought that's indented. I want you to see how that 6, 11 through 13 begin the thought, and 7, 2 through 4 conclude the thought. So I'm going to read, skipping from 6:13 to 7:2. When you realize we've already done this previously, skipping from chapter 2 to chapter 7, you're already anticipating perhaps the fact that I'm going to be suggesting we have another parenthetical section. So here's the reading beginning in 6:11. This is the NIV. We have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children, open wide your hearts also. Make room for us in your hearts. 7:2. Make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have exploited no one. I do not say this to condemn you. I have said that you have such a place in our hearts that we would live or die with you, and I have great confidence and great pride in you, and am encouraged in our troubles. My joy knows no bounds. I hope that made very clear that in 6:13 and in 7:2, there's an obvious continuation. Open wide your hearts also, make room for us in your hearts. And so we skipped over a section of text, and it's almost as though we didn't miss it. which means that we need to come back and ask about the content of this section. I guess one of the things that should happen in a Bible study is if we come through a section of text, we should feel when we finish the study that we have at least some understanding and perhaps an improved understanding of what that text is really all about. And so I want to spend a little more time than we might normally spend in 6:14 to 7:1. This is a parenthesis, as I've noticed. And I want to suggest that this is a warning from Paul to the Corinthians about their loyalties and their relationship with the false teachers. Paul is appealing for reconciliation between him and the Corinthians. The ministry of reconciliation is not only a sharing of the gospel with those who need to be reconciled to God, but the ministry of reconciliation also means that we ourselves have been reconciled one to another. It's not just what God wishes by way of relationship with his creation, that's a part of it, but it is also the reconciliation that is occurring between Paul and the Corinthians. The relationship between Paul and the Corinthians had been stressed and closed off as a result of the increasing loyalty of at least some of the Corinthians to the false teachers. That's what Paul is talking about in 6:11 through 13. We've opened wide our hearts. There is a problem with the conduit. There's a problem with the relationship. There's not enough liquid, this liquid of love flowing through the pipeline, but the problem is not on our end. It's not that we're failing to feed the pipeline. We are not withholding our affection from you. And so if there's a problem, the problem is on your end. You're withholding your affection from us. And let's just be fair one with another. So you open wide your hearts, even as our hearts have been opened wide to you. The reason Paul says that is so that the reconciliation of relationship might occur. But what is holding back the relationship? What's holding back the relationship is that some of the Corinthians had developed this loyalty with the false teachers, a relationship. And so the alliance between the Corinthians, at least some of the Corinthians, and the false teachers who were opposing Paul was in fact causing the Corinthian church to alter the gospel truth. And Paul more than once has identified the false teachers as unfaithful. Now in this context, I believe that's what he's talking about when he talks about unbelievers. They're rejecting the message. They have changed the message of Jesus Christ. That's the focus on the Word, the ministry of the Word. Perhaps they were Judaizers. That may be why Paul spends so much time comparing the Old Testament and the New Testament in 2 Corinthians 3. Now, the Corinthians had had a lot of trouble previously about applying Paul's instructions. For example, with this man who had taken his father's wife, it appears that their approach after receiving the first letter had not exactly accomplished God's purpose, and so Paul mentions it again in the second chapter of 2 Corinthians. And when you think about what Paul had written about marriage in 1 Corinthians 7, the extreme to which some of the Corinthians had gone was they were wanting to terminate every marriage between a believer and an unbeliever. And so we come to chapter 6 and verse 14, and we have this very interesting phrase, do not be yoked together, do not become partners. Perhaps we could translate it that way. It is a word that is used for yoking animals. It's also a word that is used for servants who have the same responsibility. For example, in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 1, Paul uses it to describe those who labor with him in the gospel. The teachings of the Old Testament were described as a yoke of slavery, Galatians 5:1. The yoke was the teaching. My yoke is light. Matthew 11 may well mean my teachings are not as difficult as if you try to obey every detail of the Old Testament, because in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1, the teachings are a yoke. The yoke is a reference to the teachings of the Judaizing teachers. In chapter 15, verse 10 of Acts, we have the same kind of reference. According to James Thompson, in his little book that was a part of the Sweet Commentary series, perhaps some of you are old enough, as am I, to remember those red books that came out probably in the 60s and early 70s. James Thompson wrote the commentary on 2 Corinthians that was a part of that commentary from the Sweet Publishing Company among us in Churches of Christ. He says that the word was also used for a team of Jewish scholars who were sent on a mission. And we have a use very similar to that of being partners together, being yoked together in the gospel in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 9, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 3, the two sisters who are having difficulties are servants together, yoked together. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 18, a reference to the elders. So Paul frequently in the New Testament uses this concept with reference to Christian ministry. In fact, if we were to look at the use of this word, be not partners, be not yoked together, the most common use in the New Testament would be with reference to those with whom we minister, those that we're co-laborers with, thinking about chapter 6 and verse 1. I'm suggesting that Paul is not changing the subject. He's talking in chapter 6 and verse 14 about the same thing he was talking about in chapter 6 and verse 1. That is, do not become partners with unbelievers. Now, some have suggested, and I feel a need to say something about it, some have suggested that this is a reference to marriage. And they have used this verse to say something about who we marry and who we don't marry, and have used that instruction that way. They've applied the verse to the marriage relationship. I follow Thompson and agree with Thompson when I say I think that's an almost impossible position. Let me tell you why. First of all, marriage is not mentioned in the context. There's nothing in the context that would suggest that we're talking about marriage. The second thing is that if you translate the original language literally, it says quit being partners with unbelievers. We have the translation, do not be partners with unbelievers, but because it's a present tense continual, it really means quit what you're already doing. Don't do it any longer. So what you're already doing, don't do anymore. Quit being linked or quit being partners with unbelievers. Now think about that for a moment. If you apply that instruction, quit being partners with unbelievers, to marriage, then you have 2 Corinthians chapter 6 saying exactly the opposite of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 15, when Paul says, if the unbeliever is willing to stay, stay with them. So how do we take 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and Paul's instruction to maintain the relationship in a marriage between a believer and an unbeliever? How do we take that instruction and how do we come to a totally opposite instruction in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 when he says, no, break that up. Quit being partners with unbelievers. I think that in the context, I've tried to make clear, I don't even see a secondary application. The subject, using the word in the way that Paul most frequently uses it, the subject is the relationship of the Corinthians as co-laborers with the false apostles. The false apostles, because they have changed the gospel, even as in Galatians 1, they are characterized as unbelievers. Well, we'll not spend more time with that. Perhaps you can study it further, and I'd be happy to visit with you about it if you wish in a personal, private way. So here we are looking at the continuation of the text, and Paul brings forth 5 questions that pair unlike things. There is no room for an alliance with the unfaithful, because there's no agreement between righteousness and lawlessness, light and darkness, Christ and the prince of evil, a believer and an unbeliever, temple worship and idol worship. And from that point of idol worship, Paul moves to a series of Old Testament quotations with the purpose of showing that we as God's people in the New Testament as well should fulfill God's promises to keep the temple. Remember what he's already said in 1 Corinthians about the temple being our bodies and the church, that the temple is to be kept clean. And so that's the context. I know we've gone over it very quickly and very briefly. That's the context of chapter 6, verses 14 through 7:1. Come out from among them, be ye separate, touch no unclean thing. I will be a father to you, my sons and daughters. Since we have these promises, purify ourselves from every contamination, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. And so he comes back in 7:2 through 4, as I've already mentioned, and we have a concluding appeal for openness in the relationship. So that's pretty much what we have. That's the end of Paul's defense of his ministry among the Corinthians. That would be the text from chapter 2, verse 14, through chapter 7 and verse 4. And so that's how he describes his ministry in chapter 7, beginning in verse 5. This, when we came into Macedonia, this keeps the continuity with what Paul was writing about in chapter 1 and 2. So here we have, as I've noted again, the defense that began in 1:12 through 2:13 and continues in 7:5 through 16. There's a larger parenthesis in 2:14 through 7:4, and then there's a smaller parenthesis that exists, as I just mentioned above, in 7:14 through 7:1. Very quickly, even though we've already studied this, let me review. I'm just going to mention these 3 points that give us a summary of chapter 7, verses 5 and onward. Paul is encouraged by Titus's report. Paul has met Titus. He had sent Titus to Corinth. Titus has traveled up the west side of the Aegean Sea, Paul up the east side. They've met in Macedonia. And Paul is encouraged because Titus brings a report that says the Corinthians have responded positively to the instructions that Paul had sent, to the instructions of Paul's visit, and now to Titus's visit. So in verses 8 through 12, Paul describes that response. Paul had written a severe letter. Remember chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 of the current letter, 2 Corinthians. Paul had written what we call Corinthians Severe, which would be a letter before 2 Corinthians, between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. He had written a severe letter, and he had been very concerned about the impact that letter would have. That's what we have described in 7, verses 8 through 12. I caused you sorrow by the letter I wrote, but I'm not regretting it now because it was temporary. I'm happy, not because you were made sorry, not because of the sorrow that I caused, but because you repented, you changed. And now what was a concern for me is a cause of rejoicing. And he contrasts, as we've already noted, the sorrow of the world and godly sorrow. And in this case, with the Corinthians, Paul's letter has caused them a greater earnestness, a greater eagerness, alarm, longing to see Paul again, concern for Paul, readiness for justice, looking at the list of words again in the NIV, and they desire to be innocent and restore the relationship, reconciliation. So Paul describes that response, and then finally the letter closes beginning in 7:13 by a final word of encouragement and rejoicing by both Paul and Titus. 13, by all this we are encouraged. In addition to our own encouragement, we're delighted to see how happy Titus was, because his spirit had been refreshed by all of you. I had boasted to him about you, and you have not embarrassed me. As everything we said to you was true, our boasting about you to Titus proved true, And his affection is all the greater when he remembers that you were obedient, you received him with fear and trembling. I am so glad that I can have complete confidence in you. The context of Paul's ministry to the church at Corinth. And so here is another intervention, and he is writing the second letter, what we know as the second letter, 2 Corinthians. He's going to send it to them by the hand of Titus. But before he sends the letter, he wants to mention a couple of other matters. He wants to talk to them about their failure to complete the offering that they had planned and promised. He wants to talk to them about the difficulties that they're encountering with the false teachers, to give them some help in how to manage that difficulty, and he gives them some final words of salutation as a part of the last chapter. So those are the things that remain in our study. In the coming 3 weeks, we'll study that part of the letter, 2 chapters at a time, chapters 8 and 9, chapters 10 and 11, chapters 12 and 13. And that will be the end of our study of 2 Corinthians. But we come to an ending point also today. We come to the end of a topic, and that is the topic of Paul's defense of his ministry before the Corinthians, trying to explain to them why he has acted as he has, how he wanted to be transparent, how he wanted to be open, how he wanted to serve them, and how he desired mutuality, not to control their faith, not to tell them what to do, but so that they might mature, that they might become all that God wished them to be as a part of the assembly, as a part of the church in the city of Corinth. So with that slide, I believe we come to the end of what's available. There's where we're going next week with chapters 8 and 9. So grateful for your being with us. So grateful for the opportunity to share together our time today. For those of you who have joined us by video, we bid you farewell and look forward to seeing you the next time. For those of you who are with us in the virtual class, after we stop the recording, we'll have a time to respond with various questions and comments. God's blessing to all as we study God's Word.